Good afternoon.
Whoa!
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Canaday. I'm a second-year doctoral student here at Eastman School of Music, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ann Howard-Jones, who comes to us from Boston after being Maestro Shaw's assistant in Atlanta for about 15 years or more, and knowing him for many, many years beyond that. So her experience with him and with his process and his directorial mastery has been is very long, and she has been at Boston University for many years. Recently retired, and we are so fortunate to have her here for about a month while Dr. Weiner is on sabbatical. Before we thank her, I'd also like to thank the Greater Rochester Consortium that also funded this great event, both bringing Dr. Jones here and for the showing of the movie that we're about to enjoy. So thank you both to Dr. Jones and the GRCC.
I'm a little frustrated for you because some of you won't see well if we stay seated, will you? Shall I stand up? Is that better? Anyway, I thought I would start out. Actually, I've got a frog in my throat right off the bat. I thought I would start out with what will sound familiar to some of you, which are a few of Robert Shaw's famous sayings. And I think that some of them will undoubtedly pierce some tender spot in your back if you ever sang with you. But we'll see how this goes. So the first one that I can hear him saying every day, and as he taps on my shoulder in rehearsal, I hear him say it too. He said, always said, the right note at the wrong time is the wrong note. See, you all know already. And I think it's maybe what's behind his incessant tendencies to try to tackle matters of rhythmic accuracy all the time. So he wanted the right notes to be at the right time. A note should bloom. Rarely is an initiation the loudest moment of a pitch. And think about that. I have don't slap all over my scores. You want to rise up there and slap that note. I love this one. Some of these you have to think about a minute. Every note has an isness. Doesn't that sound like him? Sing into the sleeve of the sound of the section. He and I both reject the concept of B-L-E-N-D, so much so that I can hardly say the word. He used to say, it's the next one I have here, give him 60 of the best voices that there are, and he'll make it into the greatest chorus. He's not so interested that one voice sound like another voice, sound like another voice, or that voices become a sort of amalgamation. He would rather have the individual character of each voice, which I appreciate, makes it sound so vibrant. Constantly redefine the pitch as you sing. Hence the exercise, sustain a pitch and raise it over 16 pulsations, and by the time you're at the number 16, you're up a half step. Most people who aren't musicians don't even understand how that's possible. And we know, who have done it so many times, that it demonstrates the width of a half step and the tendency that we all have to not pay enough attention to it, and inevitably the pitch starts to go down and we have to consciously work to keep it higher. Listen to this one. Diminuendo is always an intensification, not a relaxation. That would make a lot of our decrescendos a lot better, wouldn't it? And they might not sag in pitch. Consonants give emotional power to text. Whole lot of vowels, but if you can't hear the consonants, not only do you not know what the words are, but you don't get a chance to give them an emotional context. And those are the only ones I have. And I want to finish with that most famous quotation of his, which some of you who knew him in the 50s will remember. When the Shaw Chorale was being formed, they decided to write a credo. And as far as I know, this is in the early 50s. And the first paragraph of that credo I have memorized, believe it or not. Now watch, I'll forget. But 1950, remember. In these days of political, personal, and economic disintegration, could that apply to today or what? In these days of political, economic, and personal disintegration, music is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Not simply because it is therapeutic, nor because it is the universal language, but because it is the persistent focus of our intelligence, aspiration, and goodwill. The astounding thing is that he thought like that. You know, he had an unabridged dictionary sitting on his piano in his studio, and I think probably made as many references to it even during the conversation. He was very, very fussy that one would speak with the exact meaning of a word in mind, not casual speech with sort of casual words used in a sentence, for instance, and they weren't really what you meant. So he was very fussy about that. And we used to go round and round about few and fewer and towards and toward and all those funny things in the English language that he knew precisely what it was supposed to be and what he wanted to hear. Now what we're going to do next is that Miles is going to ask me some questions that might be on your minds by way of a little introduction. And then as we go, if some of you have some questions that you'd like to ask, there will be time for that too. And then we'll show what you're really here to see, which is this fantastic film. Here we go.
Actually, first I'd like to ask, how many grew up with Robert Shaw records on their LP player?
There was one.
Okay, so I see we have a few people who have heard of him and appreciate it. So was that your first exposure to him? Was through records, or how had you first heard of Maestro Shaw?
You know, I think it was on the sheets of music that we had in chorus. I don't think, we had a stereo, but it didn't get played very much. 4 kids in a household, and you didn't need any noise added to it. We produced. So I don't recall hearing a lot of music on a recording, but I do remember, some of you will remember this too, in the olden days there used to be a thing called Community Concert Series, and it was sponsored by Columbia Artists, if I remember correctly, and that organization sponsored trips to all kinds of little tiny towns in the country where famous artists would be invited to come. Well, my hometown's got 3,000 people in it, and here came the Roger Wagner Chorale. Well, what did I know? You know, so of course I went and I was just paralyzed. And in all that conversation and looking at those sheets of music, I became aware of Shaw, and then I was very aware of Fred Waring. And I can remember when Fred Waring and all of his musicians came to Rochester, Minnesota to do a concert, and my parents somehow knew that that would be something I would be interested in. I think I was 9 or 10. So off we went to this great big concert, and I heard these live chorus musicians singing like an orchestra, you know, but I think that's really the first. And it seems like from then on, every household I ever went into, somebody had one of those RCA Red Label recordings, especially of Christmas music. He was still getting royalties for those recordings, believe it or not, at the end of his life. I don't know how that was. I don't know what those deals were, but that's really how. And I don't think I knew what a figure he was in our business until I started hearing about the Robert Shaw Chorale.
So as a corollary to that, how did you find yourself in Atlanta, and then how did you find yourself working for and with Maestro Shaw?
You know, these are the darndest things, aren't they? Life takes such turns. And if you had told me when I somehow got out of school that I was going to end up near Robert Shaw, I would have said, there's no way. He's in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm in Iowa. And you know, the twain don't meet. Well, as luck would have it, I was married to a person who had a job in higher ed administration. And his first job after his PhD, University of Georgia. And people said to me, do you realize you're going to the deep south? I didn't even know really what that meant until I got there and tried to insist. But in any case, I was so foolish. For a long time, I had my own community chorus on Monday nights in Athens, Georgia. And I thought, well, now, so I was teaching at another school, and I went to Brazil on a full break. And when I came back, that was the necessary break from what I was doing in Athens. So I said, I'm going to see if I can get in that chorus. So I went and auditioned, and the next day in my studio, ring, ring, hello, Anne, this is Robert. Now, if I had my wits, I probably would have said Robert who. The voice is unmistakable, of course. And he, in the process of the conversation, said that they occasionally needed some help with section rehearsals. And I had known him a little bit because the University of Georgia put all its choirs together occasionally and brought in some guest to conduct. And Mr. Shaw came twice, and I offered to drive him around. I always thought that was a good way to get to meet the guest conductors and be their escort. So, but I still wasn't quite sure that he knew really what I did or who I was or anything else, but I could sing, and I could sing fairly well then, so that was the entree. And then there had been somebody that was his assistant, not official titles or anything, but somebody covered for him if he needed help, and that person just faded away. I don't know how that happened, but all of a sudden I was just doing it. And he was beginning to be more and more frail, and she, Mrs. Shaw, was beginning to be quite frail. And so he was absent from rehearsal more than ever. He never missed a Monday night, ever. But he started to, and so I had more and more opportunity to conduct. And when I stepped off the podium, I stepped into the chorus. So I sang in all the choruses too. And I thought that was an interesting vantage point because I could hear where the chorus was faltering and sense what needed rehearsing, maybe even more than I could have if I'd stood up in front. It's a big chorus, about 220 or so. Then I sang in the chamber chorus too. So we started our association, gosh, I guess early 80s. I'm not there. Yes, I am. So it continued until he died.
So when you did prepare the chorus, you were telling us the other day about how he handled it in terms of when he then stepped on the podium after your work.
He would sort of pat me paternalistically on the shoulder and say, now, don't worry about this, but I'm going to have to proceed as if you have not been here. I actually thought it was quite an interesting admission. As if he couldn't take it where it wasn't, take it farther. That was the silliness of it. But I understand that. For somebody that is as process-oriented as he was, for him to come into the process late in that meant a piece of it was missing for him. He wanted to work through all the steps in the process with the chorus. And so he, of course, saved a whole bunch of time. He didn't have to repeat and go do it again and do it again and do it again. And the only time I ever remember that was not the case, where he walked in and he said, okay, let's hear this from the top. And when he got done, he said, thank you, Anne. And it was my glory. So there was always so much to fix. And I told the chorus, and I used to tell the student choruses too, when he would be coming to conduct, let's hurry and get the notes and the rhythm and the kind of nitty-gritty of the music out of the way so that he can speak, rather than having to go through all of those rubrics again and again. And so that was what we really lived for his, Robert Shaw, philosopher, musician.
And was that so when let's see, the festival choruses in France was extremely highly vetted and highly auditioned, and a much smaller group, and really all professional. So how was his process any different with them? No?
No, it was a strange thing, actually. I have always been convinced that we who are trying to be responsible to our talents and our intellect should continue to get better and better. And there are so few opportunities for people, once you've finished your degree, to go back and get renewed and refreshed. You're always doing the work yourself and rarely get to study with somebody at another level. And so I was constantly looking for ways to bring him into an educational setting so who was doing the orchestra and the chorus? Himself. During that time, nobody. There was always a chorus master, and then that person gave way for the orchestra guy. But the administrative detail that would ensue, allowing people to come and have to pay a little bit and deal with all of that stuff, was just more than one little secretary, Nola, wanted to take on. So we couldn't do it that way. So we were sitting around one afternoon chatting, and I said, well, what about France? That's where you want to be in the summer. Who wouldn't want to be there? Maybe we can figure out a way to organize audition a chorus of about 60. And if they don't have to pay anything, we'll have thousands audition. If they have to pay, it'll be fewer. Oh, well, we'll pay them. So we went, I guess, 7 or 8 summers and didn't pay anything. We just went. And got to sing in that part of France where his summer home is. It's hardly on the map. It's a little crossroads called Couzou, C-O-U-Z-O-U. And we stayed in a big market town nearby called Souillac. Some of you probably heard of that. And it's in the Dordogne Valley, where there are no Americans. So all of a sudden, 60 loud singers show up in this little town, and in the salon de vin, we call it the salon de thé. They serve the most delicious homemade croissant you've ever tasted in your life. You know, just another whole experience. And we did that for a lot of years, sang all around there, and recorded everything. So that was an interesting time. And there are lots of stories about that, which we might get into later. But the famous Rachmaninoff recording, which won all kinds of Grammys, was made during that experience. There were 60 of us. And several people repeated from one year to the next. Then Judith Aaron, who was then the executive for Carnegie Hall, was always interested to try to bring Mr. Shaw back to New York and not put too much heat on him. So she came over there to visit, and she said, what about that? Would you think that would be a good idea? So it's a great idea. So we have a chorus of 200 or so, and this Orchestra of St. Luke's, and Carnegie Hall would foot the bill for all of us from the France chorus to be the nucleus. So he didn't have to start from scratch with the entire group, but he had this big nucleus that knew what he was going to say before he said it. So that, I think, helped, and we did St. John Passion, St. Matthew Passion, Brahms Requiem, Berlioz Requiem, I don't know, you name it, a whole bunch of pieces. Rehearsed in the old Manhattan Center. Some of you remember that big old space down by Madison Square Garden. Anyway, those were all opportunities that I had. And I should say, too, that I certainly wasn't the only one that was at his beck and call. I don't know whether he thought he needed a lot of help, but there certainly were a lot of us around that if he'd sort of snapped his fingers, several of us would jump. And Carnegie Hall had the same thing. They had a little entourage of people that were designed to be his helpers. And they were standing around, and they had nothing to do with anything. The rest of us just, he needed something, we'd run get it, you know, and he needed a word to finish a sentence, I could fill it in. You know how silly that stuff is, but we worked closely together for all of those projects too.
Well, speaking of jump if needed, can you tell us about the Rachmaninoff recording and what he required for the church acoustically?
We, recording in those market towns is a bit of a challenge because they're noisy. And it's the center of the city, little town, so there's all kinds of commotion. So this happened after 10 p.m. at night, and it was the only time it was really civilized anyway, because nothing's air conditioned, it was hot. So we went into this big church in Gramat, G-R-A-M-A-T, France, but beforehand, a bunch of people had gone to the police station. Would they please not run their sirens? To the ambulance place, would they please not run their sirens? To the neighboring households, would they please keep their dogs in? I mean, can you imagine knock at the door? Would you please keep your dog in? Yes, tell the baby not to cry. Close all your windows. To try to get it to be a little bit free of outside noise. And mostly it was successful, except if you listen carefully at the end of the recording, there's a church bell that rings. You have to kind of know that it's coming and listen for it. And then we took with us all kinds of blankets from the school where we were sleeping in Souillac to deaden the sound. Of course, you weren't supposed to take one thing out of that school. I have a great picture of him with some pork pie hat and a great big armload of blankets standing there looking like, I don't know what, cat that ate the mouse. But then he wanted the church rearranged. So it was a big internal space and long, maybe 14-foot heavy wooden pews that were in the stone floor on about 7-8 inch spikes coming up out of the stone. Okay, men, lift all those pews off those spikes and arrange them in a circle. So, of course, they did that. It was hard work, really heavy, not a circle going. And the men in the chorus stood on those pews. Now, they stood with the lift in the pew going the wrong way, so their heels are below their toes. And then the women sat on chairs in the inside of the circle. The microphone was in the middle of the circle, and he stood under the microphone. Disaster in the making! Because he was noisy. And the first thing that was noisy was his Reeboks on the stone. So off came his shoes. And of course, he had on the French sort of worker's uniform, white socks, blue suit thing. And so off came his shoes, and that wasn't so bad. And then he'd go to get a sound started. And the teller guys would say quietly, well, that was just beautiful, but I'm afraid we can't use it. No explanation. And I don't know if he'd had these kind of run-ins about this very thing before or not, but I mean, he was a sitting duck, because the microphone was right smack above his head. Well, this happened about 4 times, until finally the physician, who was a singing baritone in the chorus, grand voice, had a medical kit with him and got out some surgical tape to his mouth. Now, some people still think that's really funny. I just about cried. I thought, this is really pathetic. You know, that we have to put him through this. Well, and about one more time, and they said, I'm sorry, but there's just too much noise. He marched out from the center of that circle, walked right past me, and walked out the door, and said to me on the way by, you finish it. You don't want to do this with me. Now, Noel's on this side of me saying, well, get up there. And the person on this side is saying, if you move. So I got up and went after him. But I think he put us in some difficult situations like that, because his personality was pretty sensitive, and he was, to the very end, I guess the best word is insecure. You just couldn't praise him enough, and if you praised him, he didn't like it. You know how people like that are. So we finished that recording, and it was under enormously, well, technical duress, I guess you'd say. And it ended up being just fantastic. I hope you'll think so when you listen to it.
Absolutely. I guess at this point, could you talk to us about gesture and body motion, body stillness and gesture, and how your approach to teaching conducting, and how that intersects with his approach to teaching it, and also how he performed both in rehearsals and on the stage?
You ask a tough question. I'm a person who is, and I think I learned this from him, the core is where the conductor needs to be really strong. And the platform for the conductor has to be solid and mostly not moving. He was really good at that. Then I try to teach that the most important thing is the tip of the stick. For him, I think he would probably say that, but the tip of the stick didn't move very far. Can you remember seeing him? I have to put this down. He's got his baton and he's got his other hand and he does this. His hands are hardly moving at all because its motion is all in his elbows. And once in a while he'd make a big gesture, but most of the time his hand motion is quite small. Of course, his knee is going like mad, foot tapping, all that stuff that we discourage students from doing. But I think that the thing that was so amazing, and he probably learned this from Toscanini. I didn't ever see Toscanini live, but some of you probably did. He was a very, very small motion conductor. And Mr. Shaw worked with him for some time, and I think he realized, maybe Zell too, because Zell wasn't very flamboyant, you Cleveland people, right? And so I think he was learning that you didn't have to be too flamboyant. In fact, he didn't want you to be flamboyant on the podium, but the smallest gesture could still communicate. And I would say too that he didn't count on having to show too much on the podium. He would say, I'm going to leave the music making to you, and I'll meet you at the cadence, or I'll meet you at the change, or I'll meet you. And I think people that knew how he rehearsed would say, well, okay, because he's making you count sing, and he's making you take care of the lengths of all the fermatas, they're all written out, nothing depends upon him. He was very unsure of his own gesture and whether he could count on it or not. And so he didn't want us to have to depend on that. So every fermata in every work has +3, +2, +1, and it's all through the instrumental parts too, so that we took responsibility for how long that was, whether he indicated it carefully or not. And I think that the idea about tempo, rhythm and tempo, was so built into us in rehearsal that he, of course, made a good decision about tempo in the first place, rehearsed at tempo as often as possible, and then maybe some division of it. He wouldn't go just some sort of approximate version, slower, but he would go twice as slow. So there always was a relationship that we were constantly reinforcing, so that the matter of maintaining the speed was more up, he would say, would be more up to us than to him. Well, if he would make a mistake on the podium, he'd conduct his shoestrings, never look up, never walk off the stage and disappear. Just so fragile. And that happened any number of times. I was telling them yesterday about a time in France. We were singing outside, of all things. And one of the pieces was the set of pieces of Debussy, the Trois Chansons. And the first one, Dieu, starts on beat 2, right? Dieu qui l'a fait. Well, he gave 2 preparations. And of course, some people fell in after the first one. So he went, and some people sang Dieu, but he really meant that to be 1. So he'd go 2, 1, 1 again. Well, that was, I mean, we sorted it out. We didn't stop and start over. We just sort of sorted it out. Afterwards, Jones, come with me. So off stage we'd go, and he said, can you fix that? No. Yes. I mean, I tried not to say if you'd have conducted that correctly.
So at times he had I guess a difficult personality to deal with, but sometimes he had
Yes.
he had an incredible eloquence about him. You mentioned this giant dictionary that was sitting on his piano at home, and you said he was just so particular in the way he addressed music and the ideas of music to the chorus and to audiences. And why do you think that was, and where did that come from, and why was that so important that he and others speak about music so eloquently?
This is a little bit of a guess because we didn't ever really talk about it, but he was originally in training to be a preacher. His father was a Disciples of Christ evangelical preacher, and I think he thought he was going to follow in that line, so everything he thought about had to do with clarity of expression and the contemplation of difficult truths. And I think he worked on that all his life. But he gave speeches like professional speech makers give speeches, only they were really, really interesting to listen to. So I was telling the students the other day, I was at the University of Illinois, and the chancellor at the University of Illinois came up to him after he gave a speech at a performance at Illinois, and the chancellor said, you know, I listen to speeches for a living, which I guess, you know, most people do. And he said, but I've never heard a speech like this. And did you write it? Yes. Well, did you have anybody edit or help you? No. Well, I'd like to see your speeches. Do you keep them? Yes. And the same thing happened at Boston University. About the second year I was there, the president of the university and I contrived to bring him to speak at baccalaureate and get an honorary degree. Guess with whom he shared the podium? Ross Perot. So there was already an interesting experience. So Mr. Shaw gave his famous The Conservative Arts speech. President of Boston University was John Silber. Some of you probably know that notorious name, right? And he called me immediately. He said, what in the world is this guy going to talk about? The conservative arts. I said, don't you worry, Dr. Silber. He's going to speak about the conservation of the arts and how important it is to conserve them. Oh, well, that'll be fine. And he gives this speech that leaves the preachers, the theologians in the room paralyzed. That's printed. He didn't let it be printed for a long time because he extracted some things from it a lot of times and used it in other instances, so he didn't want everybody to have a copy of it, that he couldn't use it again and again. But now it's printed so you can see it. Unbelievable a discussion about how art, music in particular, but art in general, is so essential to the development of a human being. And Ross Perot, down the steps of the chapel, standing in the patio, that's that Martin Luther King statues in the patio at BU, some of you have probably seen it. Ross Perot says, pardon my accent, Robert Shaw, if I had your speechwriter, I'd be President of the United States. I never really answer your questions, do I?
Absolutely. I guess we don't see that too much today, and it's unfortunate that we don't have such a forerunner in terms of someone who is a representative for the arts, speaks passionately and eloquently about the arts, and is a performer. You see that to some degree from certain conductors or certain performers. Leonard Bernstein comes to mind, but today you don't unfortunately see that too much, which is unfortunate because we need all the advocacy that we can get.
You know, I didn't realize it, but he was on the National Endowment panel for some time. I didn't ever hear him speak about that, and I wasn't aware that he was doing it when I knew him. But that, talk about a voice that would be an eloquent one on a panel like that. And of course now we're worried that it's even not going to be in existence. So we need good, strong, well-spoken advocates that can talk about more than just pie in the sky. You know, we have to be able to talk about how music communicates the soul.
I was going to say Meryl Streep is speaking from that part of the arts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. We'll take it.
Yeah.
Tilson Thomas can speak about it too. Those of you that know about his, do they call them young people's concerts? I don't know. But I can remember sitting in front of the television and watching Bernstein's young people's concerts when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. Just thought, my gosh, I wonder how you get to do that.
Absolutely. What part of his legacy for you lives on, and what do you think today his legacy for others and those who sang with him? What part of that, besides his advocacy for the arts, certainly, and the commitment to the choral craft, if you will, what is paramount in terms of his legacy?
I suppose it's the constant striving for the right note at the right time. You know, it's the excellence that he stood for, and he got out of the most amateur of us. He brought us to places we could never have gone by ourselves. And always with, what do you mean you can't do that? Of course you can do it. And then once you do it, we're going to do it 10 more times, so we're sure you can repeat it. I mean, just never accepted anything less than the highest degree of excellence. High quality music. That, I wasn't ever there, but that was at a UCC church in Cleveland. I forget, was it? And here he was with Charles Ives and all of this kind of crazy music that people were having to listen to when they show up on Sunday morning for church. And
Shaker Heights.
Shaker Heights,
First
right.
Unitarian.
First Unitarian, okay. And that, some of those standards, if you put those in front of a church choir today, they want to sing, I won't even say any titles. But the music doesn't challenge anything. It's immediately accessible, which I think is fine, but how about a challenge? How about, gosh, where did that text come from? I wonder what that meant. And I usually tell the students if it's the composer and then the text is by the composer's wife, forget about it. Several important composers have to be left out of the discussion. One of them lives around here. But I think it was I don't think the guy had written a check. Everything that he did was in service of his art. Started every day at 11 and worked slavishly. His office was in the downstairs of their house in Atlanta, and I'd come to meet with him and I'd hear him plunking out. Wasn't a good pianist, not a particularly good singer, trying to solfege with like viola part. just slugging away at it. No shortcuts, he always said. Have to do your work. And people would call and say, you look at your score for the, fill in the blank. And he'd say, do you have your own markings in your own score? Well, no, I was hoping to use you. And that was the end of that. So if you were willing to do the work, and then he could always elevate it. There was no question about that. I think that's what I would say, that he has inspired me to strive and strive and strive and never stop striving. And then I've had the great opportunity to drag some students along with me. He didn't ever have much of that, which I regret. He got a Guggenheim one time, fairly early on, and the idea was he was to write a conducting textbook. Never happened. So I think the letters that he wrote weekly to the members of the chorus became that. And one of the things I'm hoping to do, I don't know if I would have, before I croak, whether I would have time to do it, but I think it would be interesting to try to pull out of there suggestions for the beginning conductors. As there's a lot that one could learn from that. But there's a stack of single-spaced letters about like this. Hundreds of them.
I'm sorry, you may be going on with questions. I didn't know if you were...
I had one more question for Dr. Jones before we open it up to questions, but which was, can you talk a little bit about his service concerts? So the concerts that he put on that were specifically social justice and social service minded.
There was a lot of discussion about why he would go to Atlanta. Now, Caroline, the second wife, is from Atlanta, and she was, grande dame of the society. She was a member of the Historical Society and all of that. Her father founded Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. So she was a well-established figure there, and he also knew that Ralph McGill was the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And this was at a time when all hell was breaking loose in terms of racism and racial cooperation. So there is that grand consortium of African-American schools in the city of Atlanta. Morehouse and Spelman and Morris Brown and I think two others. And he thought, I'd like to be in that city where those kinds of issues are being dealt with. And maybe through great music we can help that situation. And so the orchestra would, from time to time, haul itself down to South Atlanta and play a concert at Morehouse, for example. And then the hope was that the audience at Morehouse would be enticed downtown. Rarely happened. And there are a lot of complicated reasons, I'm sure, not the least of which is transportation. And then from time to time he would say, we're going to invite the Morehouse men, that's a distinguished African-American male chorus, to sing on the Christmas festival. Some of you probably have seen those televised programs. There's big Morehouse men, and then the whole symphony chorus, and then a children's chorus. The stage is full of musicians from every age, every socioeconomic group, every color. And that delighted him. But I think we would say, I tried to start a symphony youth chorus, youth symphony chorus. And it took us into all parts of the city where there were things like, well, the kids would show up for the rehearsal and they didn't have any music, of course the music, well, the teacher has the music and she can't come. That kind of stuff. Where are your pencils? Well, the teacher brings the pencils. Or my mother couldn't transport me today, so I had to miss. That kind of stuff happening all through, and it's a big sprawling city. So there are some big challenges to making those things happen, and I think he would say, in the end, it didn't really integrate well. There was an attempt, and certainly people like Uzi Brown and David Morrow and the leaders at Morehouse. Most importantly, the first guy, Wendell Whalum, who was an organist, happened to be a colleague of mine at the University of Iowa. He was doing his doctoral work. So I knew him for a long time. And the opportunity to put that whole arrangement together with this symphony was too good to be true. And so he worked very hard at that. Made speeches there, everything else. Is that sort of what you had in mind? And I think that not very many. It was expensive to travel with a great big orchestra. They didn't even go to Athens very often, the university. There wasn't a great auditorium there in the first place, and it just cost a lot of money still does, to take a group away. And that orchestra is struggling like so many others. And the way the management wants constantly to control the budgets of the orchestra is to cut personnel. Well, the violin section is 16 in a professional orchestra. It's not 12. That sort of thing is what's happening. So all professional groups like that need your help.
Absolutely. Okay, we will now open it up to questions. So Hannah has a microphone. I think you had a question first.
So you touched on different parts throughout your talk, and I'm looking for how over time the choir director, and maybe from Meister Shaw, and you picked up the ability to, between reprimand a choir and inspire a choir, and how did you develop that over time so you don't discourage the choir, but at the same time call them on things, you know, but still inspire them? You said higher and higher. And that can be really tricky with someone who's already a little bit insecure. And so I'm just curious how that all worked out over time.
I say this to conducting students, a good conductor really needs 3 things only: a great ear, a great musical imagination, and the ability to get the people in the choir to do what you want them to. And that's the tricky one, of course, is the latter. There are complete and total jerks who conduct, who get people to make good music. Go figure. There are complete and utter fools who stand up in front of choirs and get them to make music. Go figure. I'm not exactly sure what the magical combination is. I think it's, I would like to say that a big chunk of it is on the quality of the repertoire you choose to work on. And that will elevate a circumstance faster than about anything. And then, of course, the conductor has to be skilled. And I think you have to know when you're calling somebody out with a smile and when you're just so bloomin' tired of hearing the same mistake over and over again that you really want to get a little edgy. But I think nobody, it's my opinion, that nobody wants to come to rehearsal and get beat over the head. And adults especially, who are so busy, and they carve out 2 or 3 hours to come and be abused by you? I don't think so. So I suppose it's walk a pretty fine line, because I'm not going to let it be slack, you know. And you probably remember the other night I said, no, you can't make a tone like that. You have to make a tone like this. You know, and just don't put up with, but don't be uncivilized about it. What would you say?
Well, have you changed over time? Meaning, like when you first started, you were this way, and now
No,
you're
I
this
don't.
way?
I think it's my personality.
It's your personality.
And it's not, you can't teach it, you know, to somebody who doesn't have it, I think. You agree, you guys, you conductors? And I think it's one of the reasons why job hunting is so tricky, because it's hard to show your personality in an interviewing situation where the situation is so contrived. And anyway, I don't think really groups should be organized around the conductor's personality. So it's a sort of out of both sides of my mouth.
Exactly. Okay.
I had one band teacher one time. I was so grateful for his taskmaster attitude. No, you're not playing that together. Do it again. No, you're holding that note too long. Do it again. And that somehow didn't seem harsh to me. We had an outstanding band, little tiny town, you know, outstanding band, and it was only because he insisted. The choral conductor was much more easygoing, and we always did fine, but not because of her sticking to it. What would you guys say? Yes, ma'am. Another question?
I do have a question. In my grammar school, everybody sang,
Yes.
and our teacher was trained by Fred Waring, and so we always had to have a Fred Waring representative in the audience, you know, supervising her and giving her feedback. But one of the things that was helpful to me as a kid was that all of the words were written phonetically beneath. And I'm wondering if Robert Shaw had an opinion about giving that kind of leg up.
We call them tone syllables. And if you don't see the real English text and you just see those words all strung together, you can hardly tell what language it is. But we all of us that sang out of those editions had those things. He didn't want to claim that at the end of his life, Shaw. I think he learned a whole lot more about diction, but what he was trying to do was get all the sounds of sing all the sounds of all the words is another thing he said over and over again. So that you start like the word who, for instance. So it starts with an asterisk. It isn't ooh, it's who. And if the chorus can't articulate that, then somehow those kinds of things weren't always able to be notated in that system. But the M's and the N's and the NG's and the L's, the liquid consonants, were all etched together with those little slur markings. And I haven't seen an edition that's new. I just know those old editions. So I don't know if anybody's gone back and taken those tone syllables out of those old Shawnee press, remember?
Yes.
Those little editions. There is a person.
With Alice Parker.
Yeah, sure. With Alice, yeah. There's a person who knows about all of that music at Shawnee Press, and apparently it's in some kind of archival situation. I, of course, can never remember his name, but it's not so far away from us here because it's in eastern Pennsylvania. So somebody should be on the trail of that.
If there was one word that I remember from 1952, 53, 54, it was intensity. Intensity to the art form, which inspired me to do the same thing the rest of my life. My question is, who did he look up to? Who were his models, if there ever were some that he talked to you about?
Well, yeah, I think that despite the fact that he always said his entire life was a makeup lesson, because he never really studied. So the first person that he encountered was his mother, who was a sweet-voiced church singer. And people say that's why the soprano sections in all the Shaw choruses are sweet-sounding sopranos. They're not big Wagnerian sopranos. So he was hearing that sound. He was hearing that sound. And I don't think he ever really looked up to Fred Waring. Fred Waring was kind of not a nice man. But all I heard was the kind of difficulties of that. But he had a lot of opportunity to learn from him. And then in the meantime, here's Toscanini, who gave him that tremendous compliment. All along the way, he was in New York, and William Schumann was the president of the Juilliard School. You remember all of this? And William Schumann was a wise man. He saw Robert Shaw in his 20s and 30s, I guess. Went up to him and said, Mr. Shaw, Robert Shaw, you're too talented to know as little technically as you do. So let's get you to Cleveland, and let's let you work with Zell, who's the technical taskmaster, analyze music well, all that stuff. Well, those two, Zell and Shaw, were like oil and water. I mean, I think Shaw respected him, learned from him, all of that, but they weren't really collegial. These Cleveland people are not. And then the next thing that happened was he ran into Julius Herford. And Julius Herford was for a long time a professor at Indiana University and held forth there. And he and Mr. Shaw had an affinity for one another. And I would say that maybe, without knowing too much about his personal life, that would maybe be the first professional that I was aware of. And he has, the Herford analyses are all over all of us who study choral music. We make charts like Julius taught us to make charts. And Shaw and Julius Herford would spend days together, and Mrs. Herford would fix some cheese sandwiches, so they didn't even have to interrupt to take a little time for lunch. This guy, I sat beside him for hours auditioning. Never went to the bathroom, never took a drink. Before I knew all that, I thought one day, well, we're going to be in France, it's hot, maybe I'll have the kitchen bring a little fruit salad or something. You should have seen him. Who brought that in here? Well, I thought maybe, I don't want it, I'm working, get that out of here. And if you dared put a cold drink down on the table where his papers were, I never tipped one over, but if you had, you would have heard about it. I mean, he was just in his own world. And the only other thing I would say about all of this that we're talking about is I think it's very difficult to say, this guy is clearly a genius. Now, I'm going to put up this barrier and this block and that, and I'm going to make him do this and this and this. You just really want to let them have their lead, let them go. And he did so much for us in choral music particularly, but there's nobody like, there has been nobody like him. And people say, well, who's his successor? It doesn't matter. There doesn't need to be a successor. He was the one. And we probably ascribed more greatness to him than he deserved. But the more I read and the more I study and the more I look at what he was talking about, the more profound it is. Nothing too superficial about him.
What are your favorite choral works, and if you know Shaw's, works that are hardly ever performed?
Well, certainly Shaw was closely attached to the Hindeman Promida class in the dooryard room. And this chorus, the Eastman Rochester Chorale has sung that piece, right?
Yes.
Came here to conduct it. Well, he commissioned that piece, and you've heard those funny stories. Hindeman was at Yale when the piece was first performed. So Mrs., let's see now if I'm going to get this wrong. Somebody asked Paul Hindeman how many tickets he wanted for the premiere performance. Well, he said, I don't think I need any. Right. And the person didn't quite thought maybe he was joking or something. He said, well, do you think that you can play it better than I can hear it? He was kind of a snob, too. And then that same performance, here comes the baritone solo. It's a big baritone solo and it's hard. And of course, nobody knew it. It was premiere. And the baritone was struggling. So Shaw says he's conducting away. Pretty soon, he feels something yank on his pant leg. And here's Hindeman down below the podium yanking on Shaw's pant leg. He said, it's written right in one of his letters, for heaven's sakes, worse. For heaven's sakes, Robert, find out what notes that guy can sing. I can write them. He was around people that minced few words. And I think that Hindeman he had the collegium at Yale, the early music groups, and it's from him that Shaw learned that quiet rehearsal was more effective than loud rehearsing. Because Hindeman always made everybody play everything under the dynamic, so they could really hear. So I think he was learning from everybody. He did the music for one of the Olympics, Billy Rose. You remember that name? A little bit before my time, but it was in one of the 40s Olympics, and Robert Shaw was in charge. You know, how he got himself into those situations, and he had no idea what he was doing. But somehow, he'd muster it, and he'd do what he thought would be the best thing, and it was better than anybody ever thought of, and away they went. I think it was the same thing with the collegiate chorale, that big group that he had going at the church where Norman Vincent Peale was the pastor, collegiate church in New York. And you know, they kicked him out of there. You remember that story? The collegiate chorale was rehearsing in the basement of Norman Vincent Peale's church. And Shaw was never one to watch his mouth. And here they are in the house of the Lord. And Vincent Peale got word of this and called him in and said, "No, Mr. Shaw, you have to be careful about cussing. And by the way, I understand that you have some people of color in your chorus. You'll have to find another place to rehearse." Now, would you have expected that of that man? When Shaw turned 80, there's a handwritten note from Norman Vincent Peale to Robert Shaw saying, "At that time, I forget the date now, I made one of the worst decisions of my life. Please forgive me." But it took a long time. So bad stuff like that happened too. The Atlanta Symphony fired him about 4 times because he kept doing too much modern music. So he'd say, "See ya," and then somebody would come crawling and say, "We didn't really mean it. We need you to come back." So he'd crawl back. It was not always a happy thing. But we went that horrible fire on Interstate 85 in Atlanta. Lord have mercy. But we would have laid across that road for him. And it's a little stupid, it's a little blind but we somehow knew he wasn't going to lead us astray. Musically. You want to look at this film? It's fabulous. You already see so much of me on it, it's embarrassing.
Well, thank you very much, Dr.